When a tank commander's radio crackles with static in the middle of enemy territory, the difference between life and death often comes down to one thing: whether someone far from the battlefield knew how to fix it. This is the story of the invisible army that never wore uniforms, never fired weapons, but saved thousands of soldiers by keeping the machines of war running when official channels failed. What happens when the fate of entire military units depends not on generals or soldiers, but on farmers, factory workers, and teenagers armed only with welding torches and improvised tools? Throughout World War II, civilian repair networks operated in shadows across multiple theaters of war, from occupied Europe to Pacific Island workshops to home front factory floors. These weren't official military operations, they were improvised systems born from desperation, where ordinary people with mechanical skills became the last line of defense for broken equipment that armies couldn't afford to lose. The official military supply chains couldn't keep pace with the brutal reality of mechanized warfare. Tanks broke down every few hundred miles. Aircraft needed constant maintenance. Radios failed in humid jungles. When spare parts took weeks or months to arrive through proper channels, soldiers either abandoned equipment worth millions or turned to local populations who knew how to improvise. The pattern began almost immediately after major powers mobilized for war. In 1940, as German forces pushed through France, French civilians in occupied towns started secretly repairing Allied vehicles that had been abandoned during retreat. Mechanics who ran small garages before the war suddenly found themselves working by candlelight, stripping parts from destroyed vehicles to rebuild others. One documented case from late 1940 involved a civilian blacksmith named Henry Moreau in a village near Reims. According to resistance records, Moreau and 3 other villagers spent 6 weeks rebuilding the transmission of a British Matilda tank that had been left in a barn. They used parts from tractors, improvised gaskets from leather, and tested it only at night when German patrols were less frequent. The tank was eventually smuggled south and later used by Free French forces in North Africa. Here is the question: how do you fix a tank when the manual is written in a foreign language and half the parts don't exist? By 1942, the pattern had spread to the Pacific theater. On islands across Melanesia and Polynesia, indigenous populations and colonial settlers found themselves caught between Japanese and Allied forces, surrounded by broken machinery from both sides. In Papua New Guinea, village workshops began operating as unofficial repair stations for Australian and American units. Local workers learned to fabricate replacement parts using materials from crashed aircraft, salvaged ships, and pre-war mining equipment. A particularly well-documented operation ran on Guadalcanal starting in late 1942. After the initial Marine landing, civilian construction workers who had been building airfields before the war stayed behind to help maintain equipment. August 1942 to February 1943, Guadalcanal. These men, most of them from Pacific Island nations or Asian backgrounds, worked in conditions that would shut down any peacetime operation. They repaired bulldozers under artillery fire, welded aircraft frames during air raids, and kept generator systems running through tropical storms. One worker named Tavita Solomona, originally from Samoa, reportedly kept a critical water pumping station operational for 3 months by fabricating new parts every few days as the originals failed in the humid climate. According to unit commander reports, his improvised repairs allowed the airfield to remain functional during a period when proper replacement parts were unavailable. Without that water system, the airfield would have become unusable, potentially changing the outcome of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The Eastern Front produced some of the most desperate and innovative civilian repair operations. In cities under siege like Leningrad and Stalingrad, civilian factory workers transformed production facilities into repair depots while battles raged nearby. Women, teenagers, and men too old or injured for combat worked around the clock. They weren't just fixing vehicles, they were rebuilding them from scratch, using whatever materials existed within the siege perimeter. In Leningrad, during the winter of 1941 to 1942, a group of civilian engineers at the Kirov plant reportedly converted civilian tractors into improvised tanks by adding armor plating scavenged from destroyed buildings and naval vessels. These weren't sophisticated vehicles, but according to Red Army records, at least 48 such conversions were completed and sent directly to frontline units defending the city. Several workers died from starvation while completing these vehicles, never seeing whether their work made a difference. The pattern repeated wherever armies outran their supply lines. In North Africa, Bedouin mechanics in Cairo and Benghazi operated workshops that serviced both British and Commonwealth vehicles. In Italy, after 1943, civilian mechanics in liberated towns immediately began working with Allied repair units, bringing local knowledge of where to find materials and how to work with limited resources. The official records called them local labor. The soldiers called them lifesavers. One of the most sophisticated civilian repair networks operated in the Netherlands during the final year of the war. As Allied forces pushed into Dutch territory in late 1944, they encountered populations that had been secretly maintaining resistance equipment for years. Dutch factory workers had hidden machine tools during the occupation, preserving them for exactly this moment. September 1944 to May 1945, Netherlands. When Allied forces arrived with damaged vehicles, they found civilian workshops ready to help. In the town of Eindhoven, civilian workers at the Philips Electronics factory reportedly repaired over 200 military radios between September and December 1944. The factory had been producing for the German occupation, but workers had sabotaged production while secretly maintaining their skills. When liberation came, they shifted immediately to Allied equipment. One radio technician named Peter van der Berg allegedly worked 72 hours straight repairing communication equipment for Canadian units preparing for Operation Veritable. His work kept an entire brigade in communication during critical phases of the operation. The home front produced its own version of civilian repair heroics, though the dangers were different. In American and British factories, civilian workers, many of them women who had never worked with machinery before the war, became expert rebuilders of returned equipment. These weren't new productions, they were salvage operations, taking equipment that had been damaged, destroyed, or worn out and making it functional again. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, a civilian workforce that peaked at over 40,000 people didn't just build B-24 bombers, they also rebuilt them. Aircraft that returned from Europe with battle damage or mechanical failure were stripped down and reconstructed. According to plant records, over 1,500 aircraft went through complete rebuilds between 1942 and 1945. The workers who did this included former seamstresses who learned to rivet, farmers who became hydraulic specialists, and teenagers who became expert sheet metal workers. One worker named Dorothy Miller, who had been a school teacher before the war, reportedly identified a critical flaw in the B-24's fuel system that official engineers had missed. Her modification, implemented across the fleet, allegedly reduced fuel system failures by over 30%. She never received official recognition during the war, and her contribution only emerged decades later through veteran interviews. In the China-Burma-India theater, perhaps the most challenging environment of the entire war, civilian repair became absolutely critical. The famous Burma Road and later the Ledo Road required constant maintenance, not just of the roads themselves, but of every vehicle that traveled them. Local populations in southern China, Burma, and India provided the labor that kept supply lines functional. Chinese civilian workers operated repair stations along the Burma Road, often working in areas where Japanese forces could attack at any time. According to U.S. Army reports, these workers maintained an average vehicle availability rate of over 60%, despite having almost no proper spare parts and working in remote mountain conditions. They fabricated parts using materials from destroyed vehicles, improvised tools from scrap metal, and developed repair techniques that were later adopted by official military units. In Burma itself, Karen and Kachin populations who supported Allied forces operated hidden repair workshops in jungle areas. These weren't simple operations. According to reports from Allied officers who worked with them, these civilians maintained radio equipment, repaired weapons, and kept vehicles operational in conditions that would challenge modern facilities. Several workshops were discovered and destroyed by Japanese forces, with workers reportedly executed for their activities. The final months of the European War produced some of the most remarkable civilian repair stories. As Allied forces pushed into Germany, they encountered civilian populations exhausted by years of war but possessing sophisticated industrial capabilities. In some cases, German civilians who had been forced to work for the Nazi war machine immediately shifted to repair.
Some military historians question whether civilian repair contributions have been overstated in popular accounts. They argue that official military repair units handled the vast majority of maintenance work, and that civilian participation, while helpful, wasn't as critical as some narratives suggest. These historians point to the sophisticated logistics systems that major powers developed, which generally functioned well despite challenges. Other researchers counter that official records systematically underreport civilian contributions because such work often occurred outside formal command structures. Military documentation focused on military personnel, and civilian workers were frequently listed only as local labor, without recognition of their specific technical contributions. There's an ongoing debate about motivation. Some accounts present civilian repair workers as ideologically committed to defeating fascism or supporting their nation's cause. Other analysis suggests more complex motivations, including economic necessity, coercion by occupying forces, or simply the human desire to return to productive work during chaotic conditions. The question of recognition remains contentious. Veterans organizations have sometimes resisted efforts to highlight civilian contributions, arguing that this diminishes military sacrifices. Conversely, some historians argue that the traditional military-focused narrative erases the essential support that made military operations possible. Documentation gaps make some stories impossible to verify. Many civilian workers were anonymous by necessity, particularly in occupied territories, where helping Allied forces meant risking execution. Resistance organizations sometimes destroyed records to protect participants. Colonial authorities in some regions kept poor records of indigenous workers. The technical sophistication of civilian repairs is sometimes questioned. Skeptics note that military equipment required specialized knowledge and tools that civilians typically lacked. Supporters point to documented cases where civilian improvisations actually improved upon standard military repairs by using locally available materials more suited to specific conditions. Some national narratives have politicized these stories. Soviet accounts emphasized civilian heroism to demonstrate socialist dedication. American accounts sometimes highlighted civilian contributions to justify war mobilization policies. Post-colonial historians have worked to recover indigenous contributions that colonial records minimized or ignored. Each perspective contains truth, but may emphasize certain aspects over others. The human cost of this hidden war work extended far beyond simple exhaustion. Civilian repair workers died in bombing raids, artillery attacks, and industrial accidents at rates that military records rarely tracked. In Leningrad alone, historians estimate that hundreds of factory workers died from starvation while continuing to repair military equipment, their bodies often found at their workstations. Families were torn apart by the demands of wartime repair work. Women who took factory jobs to repair equipment often worked 12 to 16-hour shifts while caring for children and maintaining households. Their contributions kept armies functional, but came at enormous personal cost. Many suffered lifelong health problems from exposure to industrial chemicals, metal dust, and dangerous machinery without adequate safety equipment. In occupied territories, the risk was even more severe. Civilians caught repairing Allied equipment faced execution. Records document numerous cases where entire families were killed after a member was discovered helping resistance repair operations. The courage required to weld a tank transmission or rebuild a radio under these conditions cannot be overstated. The psychological impact lasted decades. Many civilian repair workers never spoke about their contributions, either because they considered the work unremarkable or because wartime traumas were too painful to revisit. Post-traumatic stress affected civilian workers just as it did soldiers, but they received no veterans' benefits or formal recognition for their suffering. Children and teenagers who worked in repair operations lost educational opportunities and, in many cases, their childhoods. Some accounts describe 13 and 14-year-olds working full adult shifts in dangerous factory conditions. These young workers developed skills that served them later in life, but at a cost that's difficult to quantify. The story includes moments of unexpected humanity. Soldiers and civilian workers often formed bonds across language and cultural barriers, united by the shared goal of keeping machinery functional. Letters and diaries describe German civilians teaching American soldiers mechanical techniques, Japanese-American workers training alongside workers of other backgrounds, and enemies turned colleagues sharing meals and stories while repairing the machines of war. Military historians now recognize that logistics often mattered more than tactics in determining war outcomes. The army that could keep its equipment running usually won, regardless of strategic brilliance. Civilian repair networks were essential components of those logistics systems even when they operated informally or unofficially. Think of military equipment like a complex organism. The soldiers were the visible muscles, but civilian repair workers were the immune system, constantly fixing damage and keeping everything functional. When that immune system failed, even powerful military forces became immobile and ineffective. The German Army's logistics collapse on the Eastern Front, for example, stemmed partly from inadequate repair capacity as supply lines stretched. The technology angle reveals fascinating patterns. Many improvisations developed by civilian repair workers were later adopted as standard practices. Modifications that seemed like desperate field repairs sometimes proved superior to original designs. This suggests that the traditional military design process, which separated designers from field conditions, missed solutions that became obvious to people actually working with equipment in combat environments. From an economic perspective, civilian repair contributions represented enormous cost savings. Rebuilding a tank or aircraft cost a fraction of manufacturing new ones. Keeping existing equipment operational extended the productive life of each unit by months or years. Recent economic analysis estimates that civilian repair work may have saved the equivalent of billions in current dollars across all theaters. The cultural legacy is complex. The generation that performed this work often didn't seek recognition, viewing their contributions as simple wartime duty. Younger generations now work to document these stories before the last witnesses die. This creates tension between historical accuracy and the natural human desire to honor past sacrifices. Legally, these civilian workers occupied ambiguous space. International law at the time didn't clearly protect civilian workers who supported military operations. Geneva Conventions have since evolved partly because World War II revealed gaps in protecting such populations. The civilian repair workers who died in bombing raids or faced execution for their activities helped demonstrate the need for clearer legal protections. The engineering community has studied wartime civilian innovations with great interest. Improvised solutions developed under resource constraints and time pressure often demonstrated principles that peacetime engineering had overlooked. Some university engineering programs now teach case studies of WWII field repairs as examples of creative problem-solving under extreme conditions. Some national narratives have politicized these stories. Soviet accounts emphasized civilian heroism to demonstrate socialist dedication. American accounts sometimes highlighted civilian contributions to justify war mobilization policies. Post-colonial historians have worked to recover indigenous contributions that colonial records minimized or ignored. Each perspective contains truth, but may emphasize certain aspects over others. The human cost of this hidden war work extended far beyond simple exhaustion. Civilian repair workers died in bombing raids, artillery attacks, and industrial accidents at rates that military records rarely tracked. In Leningrad alone, historians estimate that hundreds of factory workers died from starvation while continuing to repair military equipment, their bodies often found at their workstations. Families were torn apart by the demands of wartime repair work. Women who took factory jobs to repair equipment often worked 12 to 16-hour shifts while caring for children and maintaining households. Their contributions kept armies functional, but came at enormous personal cost. Many suffered lifelong health problems from exposure to industrial chemicals, metal dust, and dangerous machinery without adequate safety equipment. In occupied territories, the risk was even more severe. Civilians caught repairing Allied equipment faced execution. Records document numerous cases where entire families were killed after a member was discovered helping resistance repair operations. The courage required to weld a tank transmission or rebuild a radio under these conditions cannot be overstated. The psychological impact lasted decades. Many civilian repair workers never spoke about their contributions, either because they considered the work unremarkable or because wartime traumas were too painful to revisit. Post-traumatic stress affected civilian workers just as it did soldiers, but they received no veterans benefits or formal recognition for their suffering. Children and teenagers who worked in repair operations lost educational opportunities and, in many cases, their childhoods. Some accounts describe 13 and 14-year-olds working full adult shifts in dangerous factory conditions. These young workers developed skills that served them later in life.